Yeah, it's an interesting one. And you put that in contrast. We're going to talk about that um, as well with the two teams that are chasing Borussia Dortmund, RB Leipzig and Leverkusen facing each other in the Topspiel on Saturday, right? The 6:30 German time kickoff. And Leverkusen win that game 3-1. And of course, that's a disappointing result if you're RB Leipzig, but you still sense that both of these clubs, Leverkusen obviously because they won, but even Leipzig, they probably, it feels like they're more content with where they are following the significant rebuild this summer than Dortmund. You would look at the table, you say, well, Leipzig and Leverkusen must be way ahead of Borussia Dortmund considering where they are. And I think that's really interesting. And I mean, Leverkusen, of course, it's a huge win for them. A win that could have also ended in a 2-2 draw. Jan Kalbrev scoring in the 97th minute to make it 3-1 and make this result a lot more decisive than I think it was. Terrier and Schick. I mean, Terrier apparently only scores bangers for Leverkusen. I think that's what he was brought in. He scores an incredible goal last week. He scored an unbelievable header to such an extent that you first thought it was actually Patrick Schick who scored it because it was such a typical number 9 goal. And yeah, he's looking great after a horrific injury that we all know can be a career ender. And so, he's looked great the last few games. And Leverkusen look like a team that if they maybe don't make the wrong coaching decision at the very start of the season, probably be a lot closer to Bayern Munich at the moment, right? They really did gamble away their first 3 games of the season, and Hjulmund has done amazing work. They're firmly embedded in that top 4 now. They look like they're going to probably stay there for the rest of the year. And this result just, against a direct competitor for the top 4, is really quite something. And I also think, they've done such a great job in integrating all these very young players. Yes, Hoffmann features, Terrier features. These are more established players, but Bade looked better. Belosian looked better. These are younger guys. Tillman had his moments, and then off the bench, Christian Kofan comes on. Kolbrev, 18-year-old player who they signed from Kaiserslautern's youth academy. It's looking really good for Leverkusen at the moment, Stefan. And I know you're writing your newsletter on them this week, but just diving into them a little bit, they have really turned around a season that started to look getting off the rails a little bit.
Without doubt, just quickly before jumping to Leverkusen specifically, let me just rhyme off how many players were missing for both teams in this game, right?
Yeah.
Bakayoko, Banzuzi, Diomande, Haidara, Henriks, Campbell, Nusa, Oedraogo, Bensagir, Matza, Palacios, Poku, Tapsoba, and Kwanzaa. That's like what? How many? Quickly, 15 or 14 first-team players.
That's a top 4 Bundesliga team right there.
That's a top, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this game really showed the difference between these two sides and Dortmund. And I know people who maybe only have a passing interest in Bundesliga, maybe just listening to this, or indeed Dortmund fans who think we're talking nonsense, wouldn't really understand his point. But I think this game showed that both these teams have something that Dortmund don't have, and that is a really impressive array of strength and depth. Obviously Leverkusen came out winners on the day. Another big game that they've won after, that game against Dortmund in the Pokal. I know they obviously then lost the Bundesliga one, but you could think you probably argue the Pokal one was maybe more important at that moment in time. But I thought it was a really good game. I thought Leipzig started better. They obviously didn't get their goal, for a beautiful goal from Schlager. Really is probably one of the best goals he's scored of his career, I'd say, maybe. I know he scored some screamers in his past, but that was one of the most well taken, finessed shots I think I've seen him score in a long time. Who's admittedly a very underrated player in my opinion, Schlager, especially for Leipzig. But then Leverkusen just kind of turned it around, and as you said, Terre scores a very Patrick Schick style header. I thought probably one of the best headers of the season I've seen so far. Wonderful goal. Schick then scores a perfect number 9 goal. And then, as you said, Kulbreath then comes on and scores a great goal himself after Leverkusen probably could have scored maybe another couple of goals in the second half themselves. And yeah, I came away from that game really impressed with Leverkusen, not just because they beat Leipzig in Leipzig, but because they've done so despite missing a number of players. Now, yes, okay, maybe Leipzig were technically missing more players, but I think for Leverkusen to go out there with, Andrik at centre half, Bellequan alongside him, not a starter, Tella on the left, attacking midfielders of Terrier and Hoffman, and I know Terrier has obviously played, but I'm not quite sure I'd say he's the first team starter when everyone's fit. And I thought Leverkusen just responded tremendously well and just showed a degree of kind of tenacity and spirit that really underpins how well Hjulmand has done since he came in there. Since he replaced Erik ten Hag, only Bayern Munich have picked up more points in the Bundesliga than Leverkusen. And I know they finished this year a few points off Dortmund. I would probably say they are neck and neck with Dortmund for being the second best team in the Bundesliga. Leipzig are obviously in there as well, without a doubt. But I think one thing that Leverkusen maybe have over Dortmund, and maybe this is something that Leipzig also have, and we'll see in the second half of the season, is they've got far more strength and depth. They've got far more interesting young players coming through that team, who are only going to get better. If someone like Tillman's only just kind of really hit the ground running, only just kind of hit the ground and got going, if you will. That whole back line's still trying to come to lines of itself. I thought Arthur on the right-hand side looked really good. And, there's just more and more kind of young players coming through with every kind of passing week. So where Dortmund, I think, are maybe a little stuck in the mud and relying on these kind of older players or players that they've been kind of, struggling to get the best out of for a while now. At Leverkusen and Leipzig have this whole new roster of exciting young players. We were talking about it when the game was on. It's like watching some Football Manager, dream sequence where it's just like two teams full of exciting young players. And you can joke about that and say, well, does that hold you back? But I think Leverkusen now that we're at the end of the year, Manu, and now we've had some time to kind of absorb what happened in the summer and see how well these players are kind of clicking, and the fact that Leverkusen acted very quickly to replace Ten Hag when they realised he wasn't the guy to kind of, look over these guys. I think we can kind of look back and see Leverkusen play the blinder in summer, because they obviously had to sell Wirtz, they obviously had to sell Frimpong. They didn't have to sell Granit Xhaka, but they eventually were more or less forced into it and had to let him go with a few other players as well. And it looked like they were kind of rolling the dice in the summer and just kind of picking up who they could get, where they can get them. And obviously, after a few weeks in Ten Hag, it looked like it was going to be an absolute disaster. But here we are in December. They're a few points off second place. In my opinion, probably the second best team in the Bundesliga right now. As I note in my newsletter, according to Opta and their expected points table, they're actually ahead of Dortmund in second place. And they now go into 2026 on really, really solid footing. The interviews with the players after the game, I thought Patrick Schick, Hjulmand, they're all full of praise for each other, saying, it's not me, it's the players, or it's not the players, it's the head coach. It's he's doing a great job. No, he's doing a great job. And, everyone's just very complimentary, very happy and just content with the way that things are going at Leverkusen. And, you could really, really see them kind of seriously challenging Dortmund for that second place. If not, I'd be very surprised surpassing them, to be honest, unless something dramatic was to happen in January and Dortmund were to seriously improve on them. But and obviously the same goes for Leipzig as well to an extent. They lost this game, which is maybe a concern for them. But for the most part, they've looked much, much better, obviously, haven't they? And I'm sure maybe Ole Werner would turn around and say, look, we were just missing too many players. I mean, Timo Werner came on. That shows how much they were struggling. But no. Very encouraging into the year for Leverkusen and Leipzig, I would say.
Yeah, I think the one thing that you may be worried about if you are Leverkusen is the AFCON, right? Because they have quite a lot of players playing the African Championships, and there's a decision now made that the AFCON is going to be only every 4 years, which I applaud. The Euros are only every 4 years. I get the reasons why it's in January. it's much easier to play it in most parts in Africa, and that it is their continental championship, and people are saying, oh, like this shouldn't be happening at this time or whatever. They have good reasons and tradition to do this, and we shouldn't be really looking down on it. And it is, for players that come from these African countries, it is a really, really important continental championship, and I think it's great that they're getting to play it. For clubs like Leverkusen, of course, it's a balancing act, right? Kofane, for example, didn't start in this game because they agreed with Cameroon that he would come off the bench and only play token minutes, and he had a few chances to finish the game. But he essentially played a few minutes and then jumped on a plane to Africa to play the tournament in Morocco, right? So, it's a really difficult balancing act. And of course, Bayer Leverkusen scout really well in Africa. They're signing players there specifically. They're always very good as a club to be ahead of trends. Remember, they're one of the first teams in Germany, in Europe, in fact, to sign players from Brazil. And now they really, have a lot of focus on Africa, and this has worked really well for their squad building. But, this is one of the drawbacks. So that's the thing that I worry about. Leipzig have a little bit of a similar issue because they have a lot of talents from that part of the world too, although most of their, I think, African players represent France for now, so might hurt them a little bit less. But I think what's really impressed me about Leipzig is their depth. Someone like Gomes, right, who they signed last January, TDM Gomes. I think he's looking like a real hot prospect, like a player that can become a really big star in the Bundesliga. Still very raw, but has quite a bit of something. Konrad Harder, remember him when they signed him, and we thought like, hey, actually that's a big deal, and he's looking better and better every single game. I think when I look at the team at the moment, and I think Haidara is someone that they're going to lose this winter. I think there's been stories about him going somewhere else. If I was them and I would do something at the moment, that midfield with Schlager, Baumgartner, and Seiwald is very solid, but it lacks a little bit of creativity. I know this is essentially the core of the Austrian national team there, but if I was someone, Ultra Ogo, when he was playing in there, he added quite a lot of creativity and that little bit extra that could combine, that could really link up the defense and midfield quite well. But without him, they've been lacking that little bit of creativity there. And so if I was Leipzig, that is something that I would maybe address in the winter.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're definitely not a kind of finished article, and I think we've talked about how they kind of pleasantly, came about and did pretty well in terms. Well, I mean, I suppose they had a difficult start against Bayern, but they kind of pleasantly surprised us, didn't they, in terms of how they came about after that defeat to Bayern and kind of really rose to prominence. But if you kind of look through their performances in terms of in the Bundesliga this season, and that's kind of all we can kind of judge them on because they're not playing in the Champions League at all. They lost heavily to Bayern. They drew 1-1 with Dortmund, which, okay, fair enough. And they've now lost 3-1 to Leverkusen. And it'll be really interesting to see how they come back after that defeat to Leverkusen, but also how they come back in terms of January. As you said, they might go into transfer market and they might even bring in more players, but from watching that game, Ole Werner looked absolutely apoplectic, to use a word. He looked furious at the way that they lost that game, and I do kind of wonder if he'll kind of go away over the winter and kind of, review the season that they've had and say, okay, we've done the basics very well, but there is something we're kind of missing in these big games. And again, I can only stress, they were missing basically half their starting 11 for this game. So, that's understandable. And maybe sometimes you just have to kind of chalk these things up to that. But that's 3 of the top 4 they've played. If you want to consider themselves top 4, they've only taken 1 point off them. So, yes, they're doing very well. But if you kind of extrapolate that out for the rest of the season, it could make a strong argument that it would mean that if they keep kind of dropping points in these kind of big games, it could mean that maybe they finish 4th. And and that win over Frankfurt recently suggests that they are certainly better than the teams around them, or just below them, sorry. But, they've got Bayern in the Pokal in February, and then they have to kind of bounce back very quickly. They play Bayern again, obviously, at the end of January as well. So I think if I was Ole Werner, I'd be probably looking at that squad and thinking, right, it's a very young team, it's very inexperienced. Take it all under your wing and understand that. But maybe we have to work a little bit better on how we deal with these kind of big games and deal in these big games, because Leipzig score. They started really well in this game against Leverkusen. They deserved that goal to go ahead. Then something happens. Leverkusen turn it on. Leverkusen show a degree of maybe maturity or a degree of grit to turn the game back in their favour, and Leipzig just kind of wither after that. And I think that's probably what really pissed Ole Werner off more than anything else. And again, that could just be down to inexperience. That could be down to the fact that they'll rely a lot on kind of younger players. But you're right. It's something they might have to address in January, or tactically speaking, or changing formation and players and stuff like that. But I think that's probably the one thing that Leipzig have to kind of walk away from the first half of the season and maybe consider.
Yeah, and find a home for Timo Werner, which I did some digging on this. Is going to be extremely difficult. There's maybe one that we can address in one of our first transfer shows if he's still around by then. But I think that he's getting minutes to basically show the world that he still exists. He's on a big salary. Leipzig would like to offload that salary, and I know that he's been linked to MLS teams and New York Red Bulls. That he didn't want that. Inter Miami didn't want him. There's now rumors to San Jose Earthquakes, and I understand that that's been sort of been muted by everyone involved. But maybe finding a home for Timo Werner and getting rid of his salary gives them the flexibility to do something else, Stefan. I think is sort of what they're hoping for.
I think RB Leipzig trying to find a home for Timo Werner kind of sums up a good 70% of Timo Werner's career. At least that's how it feels.
It's unfortunate, isn't it? Like, he's such a promising player at one point. It can really show you how a career can just go from one day to another, just go off.
Yeah, I mean, without really digging it all up and getting into it, he actually reminds me a lot of Adeyemi in the sense that a very, very gifted individual, very gifted athlete who's very good at very specific things. And if you kind of get him in that kind of tunnel vision mode of doing that single thing very well, he's a very good player. But because he's fast, because he can run with the ball, he often gets shoved out wide, and that's when he becomes pretty ineffective. And I don't really know why Leipzig re-signed him, to be honest with you, but he's a bit of a kind of albatross around their neck at this moment.
We should, one of my favorite sports podcasts out there, they sometimes do like a deep dive into players and why things have worked out or not worked out. They do both examples, and maybe that's something that we need to do every once in a while as a bonus show. Just do a deep dive, and Timo Werner would be a really good starting point. Like, where did it all go wrong for Timo Werner? Could be a good podcast. Something to think about. But yeah,
there's a kind of weird thing with Timo Werner, and I'm trying to remember what it was. I'm trying to just quickly Google it there. Like, he's kind of got this really weird reputation in the UK because he gave like really silly kind of interviews, and almost kind of like Thomas Muller-esque style, except he meant it. And like, there was like one question, like I can't remember what the one story was, like what's your favorite food? And he said like pasta with ketchup. I think that's what it was.
Oh yes, yes.
It just kind of went viral.
Well, and then obviously Dan always jokes about this, the Döner, his preference for Döner, right? There's this famous Döner shop in Leipzig that is like full of photos of Timo Werner.
Yeah, and like he doesn't understand the idea of having like scrambled eggs with ketchup and things like that. But he's a very kind of deadpanned, very kind of straightforward guy. I'll put it that way. And that maybe comes across in the pitch as well sometimes. I feel like we're getting a little distracted here.
My final thought before we move on to Bayern Munich is I wouldn't write him off completely yet. We wrote off Mario Götze, who then went to the Netherlands for 2 years and came back and still played a really important role, and is still playing a very important role for Eintracht Frankfurt. So don't write him off completely yet, I would say. I think it's just time for a change.
Do you want to know?
Steph,
Do you want to know the? Do you want to know the best? Sorry to interrupt you there, man. Do you want to know the best bit of trivia about Timo Werner? He and I share a birthday.
oh wow,
March 6th. Yeah.
okay, so there's a chance, you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. that changes everything.